They came at dawn, like vultures in safety vests, with a truck that smelled of diesel and authority. I was still half asleep when the backhoe started its slow, ugly song, and by the time I made it outside, my roof was bare where my panels had been the night before. Men in orange pointed at paperwork I had never signed, their foreman saying, polite and flat, that the HOA had ordered the removal. The HOA, the same people who sent newsletters about community barbecues and holiday lights. The same people who lectured us about trash can placement and holiday wreath size. They had marched onto my property and taken my panels, like they could just decide what belonged to me and what didn't. I stood there holding a coffee that went cold in my hand, looking at the neat, clipped place on my roof where my future used to be. For 5 years I had been paying a mortgage and also paying to make my roof an energy source, my pride. I'd spent nights scouring permits, saved when the city offered rebates, and answered every inspector's question with a thrill. It wasn't just solar. It was the reason my utility bill had shrunk, the thing my kids bragged about to their friends, the small rebellion against rising costs that had given us a little breathing room. And now it was gone, loaded onto the truck like scrap metal. I called the HOA. I called the company that took them. I called my lawyer. I posted a picture on social media and watched the comments crawl, some supportive, some gleefully righteous. Then I drove to the office, because there is something about facing a human face when the injustice is so bright and stupid. The receptionist offered me water and a glossy brochure about community values. The board members sat around a table, their faces practiced into the calm of people who believe the rules are always on their side. They read me their version. Permits were missing, shingles were damaged, neighbors complained about glare. They said we had to act for the safety and aesthetics of the neighborhood, that no one person could make choices that affected the collective. I told them what I'd done, who I'd hired, where the permits were, how the installer had certified the job. They glanced at each other, eyes like closed windows. Somebody muttered that such things happen, special cases get appealed, there are channels. Channels is HOA speak for slow suffering. I walked out of that office with my hands in my pockets and something hard simmering underneath. I had thought I was doing everything right. I had thought the rulebook and the city and the signed forms meant something. The anger was a low, steady thing that wrapped around my ribs. My kids were at school. My wife was at work. The neighborhood that cheered at our solar panels during the block party was the same neighborhood that cheered on this enforcement. Nobody had knocked on my door to ask me anything before they sent people to tear my livelihood away. For a while I tried patience. I filed complaints. I sent emails. I sat with my attorney in rooms that smelled of coffee and felt like hamster wheels. There were forms and hearings and another hearing, until all the hours used up became their own punishment. The HOA filed counterstatements with the calm cruelty of bureaucrats who know how to make time its own weapon. Meanwhile, my electric bill climbed back to its old, ugly number. The newfound quiet of not hearing my panels hum felt like a small betrayal inside the house. On a Friday night, after another pointless meeting where the board had refused to meet me halfway, I drove home and found the streetlights humming like distant promises. I'd been pacing a lot lately, memorizing every shrub and mailbox in the neighborhood, trying to catalog who would notice if something happened. I am not proud of what came next. I am telling you because the truth is heavier than the quick satisfaction of revenge. I acted. I did not tell you how to do it. I will not give instructions. But I made a choice that crossed a line that has no return on the map. The blackout was immediate and absolute. One moment the neighborhood was bathed in sodium orange streetlights and the soft TVs from living rooms. The next it was a world pulled under a velvet blanket. Cars idled with radios mid-chorus, ovens paused, phone screens flared and went dark. For a glorious, terrifying minute, there was a stillness I had never felt before. The kind that lets you hear your own breath and the confused bark of dogs. People came out onto porches in robes and slippers, eyes wide and phone beams trembling. Some laughed at the coincidence. Some cursed. Some looked around with a dawning suspicion that stole warmth from their faces. In those hours, the tone of the neighborhood changed. Doors opened and neighbors in bathrobes called across hedges. We had always been disconnected in the easiest ways. Friendly waves, fearful distance. Now, in the middle of a night we hadn't planned, people gathered. A man who had signed the removal order was on his porch talking to a teenager about keeping flashlights handy. A woman who had been my fiercest critic that week was in the street carrying a candle and a thermos of coffee for anyone who needed it. The blackout flattened status. It handed everyone the same question: what do we do now? By dawn, the generators were humming at the hospital, and the police had pulled up like dark flowers. The power company was livid and precise. News vans had not come yet, but the neighborhood had gone from suburban sleep to an unscripted reality show. The HOA president was pale as paper when he knocked on my door. He wanted answers, but he wanted it in the safe shape of blame. I told them nothing, mostly because I had nothing that would make this hurt any less, and partly because the adrenaline had made me stupidly proud. There was a point, however, when hedging on the truth stopped being a defense and started being cowardice. The law did not look kindly on me. They took statements like a ritual, the officers speaking with the formality of people who hand out consequences for a living. There were charges, yes. There were nights in a holding cell that felt colder than any complaint I had written about HOA politics. Lawyers told me about felonies and misdemeanors and the wonderful, thick book of civic responsibility. My wife cried the kind of tears that are small and deep at the same time. My children asked if I was going away. I tried to answer with jokes that landed like little stones. The court dates came like seasons. The judge, someone in a black robe who looked tired of stories and ready for law, listened while the HOA made notes about liability, while the power company produced a ledger of lost revenue. The narrative that had begun in my chest as righteous fury became painted in deposition slips as negligence, danger, endangerment. There were therapists who said I needed to look at why the incident had felt like the only option. I went to meetings where people asked me to imagine the people who had been harmed more than inconvenienced. It was worse than a moral lecture. It was the slow unpeeling of the illusion that I had been the only one who carried truth. But here is the part people forget when they render stories into neat clickbait. The HOA did not win automatically because I was punished. The fight revealed things that made other people uncomfortable. Documents surfaced. A line item here, an unsigned memo there. My neighbors started looking at the rules with new eyes. The same people who had applauded the removal of my panels now saw that the removal had been hasty, that there had been a whisper of favoritism. They asked questions at board meetings with a heat I had never seen. They began to compare the roster of those chosen to enforce with the roster of houses that had money to fight back. Slowly, a petition formed, signatures collected in neighborhoods across streets where once we had only waved. I do not want to glorify the blackout. It hurt people. A small business lost a night of perishable inventory. An elderly neighbor, who depended on a CPAP, had a terrifying hour until backup power kicked in. I have to live with that. The guilt is a constant companion, an undertow under any triumph. When people came together to demand transparency from the HOA, the moral balance of the neighborhood shifted, but it did not absolve me. It meant that the conversation changed from who had the most rights to who had the most voice. At my sentencing, there was a crowd in the gallery, some there to support me, others to make sure justice was done. The judge spoke in a voice that seemed to measure out years like coins. There were fines, community service, mandated mediation between me and the HOA, and a clause that required me to speak about what had happened to local community groups. I was surprised at the part that hurt most, the apology I had to give to people who had nothing to do with the HOA's decisions and yet had been hurt by my choices. Saying their names out loud felt like carving the memory into the air. Community service turned out to be the hardest and the most valuable part. I spent hours in the municipal office helping with energy assistance forms for low-income families, learning the bureaucratic language of programs and rebates. I stood on a stage at a community meeting and told my story cleanly, without the romancing of revenge. People asked the questions that needed asking. Why did the HOA feel so entitled? And how can we make sure homeowners have recourse without the whole thing turning into vigilante justice? We set up a committee. We wrote bylaws that actually protected homeowners' rights to sustainable installations, and we created a clearer process for dispute resolution with legal oversight. Not because I deserved it, but because a whole neighborhood had to learn how to be better. Months later, there was a hearing where the HOA's actions were reprimanded. Some members resigned. The company that had removed my panels faced penalties for not confirming permits with the city, and the community started an initiative to promote solar with education days and vetted installers. My panels were replaced, through the same process of permits and inspection, and mounted this time by neighbors who had come to understand the cost of silence. At the ribbon cutting, cheesy and yet moving, the same woman who had been my fiercest critic hugged me and said she had been wrong. It did not fix everything. Legal fees had been paid, reputations tarnished, trust broken. But there was a strange, fragile thing that had grown: accountability. What I want you to take away, if anything, is that rage is a fire that can burn your house as easily as the house across the street. There is a human tendency to want quick justice when someone with a title or a committee takes something that matters. I felt justified, and in ways I was. There were wrongs to be righted. But the moment I chose damage over dialogue, I stepped into a place where the harm I caused could eclipse the harm I'd suffered. Revenge is a lens that narrows your world until you can see nothing else. There are better ways to fight bureaucracy than violence, even symbolic. There are ways to build coalitions, to document, to litigate, to mobilize neighbors whose lights you might otherwise darken. When communities care, when people take the time to learn the rules and then change the rules, the victories last longer. I learned how fragile progress can be if it is not protected by law and by community guardrails. So if you found your panels gone tomorrow and you feel that familiar hot surge under your skin, take a breath. Call an attorney. Gather your neighbors. Speak loudly at the next meeting. Use the law because it is a slow tool, but one that keeps people alive and phones charged and refrigerators cool. Fight the HOA with everything in your pocket that is civilized and legal. If you don't, you risk becoming the thing you hate. I am still paying for what I did. I am also still paying attention, which is a small mercy. The neighborhood has shifted, not into a perfect utopia, but into a place where the word community means something more than a tidy lawn and rules enforced by faceless votes. The panels gleam on my roof again, humming when the sun is high, and sometimes I stand beneath them and feel a complicated gratitude for bare truth and for the very human chance to try to do better.